Welcome back, Defenders. Jake here. There's a lot of news to get to today. Let's start with the front lines. Ukrainians in Kursk hit back against a new Russian counterattack. A Ukrainian column of armored vehicles appears to be trying to split a Russian counteroffensive in the Kursk Oblast. So this is the video they're referring to. These are Ukrainian armored vehicles crossing the Russian border into Kursk in a brand new location. And they're doing this in response to what the Russians are doing. Zelensky confirms a new Russian counterattack in Kursk, saying that Ukraine was expecting it. The Russians have launched a counteroffensive action, and it's unfolding as part of our Ukrainian plan, according to President Zelensky. So here's the map, and the village that the Ukrainians have been focusing on for the last 5 weeks is Koronevo. And I think they just didn't get there fast enough, and Russia was able to resupply it. Bringing in new troops, bringing in more material, so much so over the last 5 weeks that they were capable of going on a counteroffensive. So the Russians were pushing south from Koronevo as well as east from the Glushkovo district. People were saying, why didn't Ukraine build defense lines? Why weren't they preparing for this? And obviously they were preparing for this. So as soon as the Russians in Glushkovo started pushing east, Ukrainians crossed the border. I've been saying this for weeks that the Russians in this region are surrounded on 3 sides. So kudos to the Russians for being bold. This is embarrassing that Ukraine is occupying their sovereign territory. So of course Ukraine knew at some point the Russians were going to attack. They were going to push. And the Ukrainians were just waiting until that day to then launch another counterattack to the counterattack to the counterattack. I think I have that right. We do have a map update on deepstatemap.live. You can see the Russians coming down from Koronevo made some progress. They have retaken some villages. And then Ukraine crossing the border heading for the village of Glushkovo. This is still the gray zone, but all of these map updates are delayed by 3 or 4 days now, so I think the Ukrainians probably will reach Glushkovo, and then any Russian forces remaining on this side will be cut off, and any Russian forces remaining on this side will be surrounded. We'll see. Either way, it's still a difficult fight on the territory of Kursk. Russia has quadrupled their troops in the region. Going back in time, 6 weeks ago, they probably had about 10,000 troops in this area. And now they have 45,000. Putin and the High Command, they do want to retake this territory. This is a huge propaganda defeat when they can't even hold on to their own country's territory. So I don't see Ukraine expanding, but once again, it's a war of attrition. If the Russians want it back, they're going to have to fight for it. And they're going to have to expend massive resources and lose lots of troops to take back this territory inside of Russia. And we see Russia's standard playbook unfolding. There are lots of reports, pictures, and videos of the Russian military dropping glide bombs on their own settlements and cities, absolutely destroying every single home. There's more than 10,000 Russian civilians probably still remaining in these occupied areas. And Russia's intent is just to kill them all. Destroy every house, every building, so that Ukrainian forces can't remain in this region. If you want to see the videos, I'll link them down below. But funny enough, there were some prisoner of war exchanges. I'll talk more about these at the end of the video. But I have to share this clip of these 2 Ukrainian defenders being told. They've been in Russian captivity for more than a year, so they don't know certain things about the war. And this woman on the bus is explaining to them that Ukraine recently invaded Russia. And you just have to see their reaction.
Щось, не знаю, про Курщину знаєте, що Україна?
Про що?
Курську область, знаєте?
Не знаю.
Ми захопили частину Курської області. Серйозно. Україна в місто Суджа, да, ми там навіть були, тобто ми захопили частину території Росії.
Тож наша,
Так, війна зараз проходить в тому числі на території Росії.
коли Хрущов віддавав Крим Україні,
Так,
він
так.
гриз шматки України.
Угу.
То Україна.
Так, все так і є. Ще з такого хорошого в нас.
Just imagine if you had been paying attention to this war for the first couple months and then slipped into a coma for 2 years, only to wake up and learn that Ukraine has invaded Russia, the front lines in the Donbass region have barely moved, and Ukraine is now operating F-16s. I think you'd be pretty surprised. These men, I believe, have been in Russian captivity for over a year. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Russians may struggle to maintain offensive tempo in Donetsk after Kursk redeployments. Ukraine's incursion into Kursk Oblast reportedly disrupted Russia's new offensives in northern Ukraine and slowed the advances in Donetsk. And sure enough, we can zoom in on the city of Kursk. The Russians have not made progress in the last week or two towards the city, but there is this pocket down here of mostly tree lines and empty fields, and the Ukrainian forces are surrounded on 3 sides. Every day they pull back, I think, another tree line, and they're probably going to fall back to this small stream right here. Another part of the map we should maybe mention is the city of Vuhledar, or the settlements. Vuhledar has been holding for over 2 years. Some of the most famous failed assaults of the entire war have been on this tiny village of Vuhledar, but the Russians have made progress getting across this highway over here, and I do think over the coming weeks the Ukrainian defenders might have to eventually pull back. But once again, with this war and the way that Russia fights it, thinking about how many casualties they've sustained, and they're just going to keep going. This village, this village, this village, this village, this village. How many armored vehicles, how many meat assaults, how many troops killed or wounded to keep advancing, and Putin doesn't care. But objectively, if you just look at the map, 2.5 years into this war, this is insane for Putin and the Russians to want to continue it. So let's now get to the difficult story. I know there's a lot of people on the internet right now furious with the United States, upset about this topic. As an American, I'm going to attempt to try to explain it. No green light yet for Ukraine's deep strikes. UK's Starmer reports after a White House meeting. So the UK Prime Minister met with President Biden to talk about this issue, long-range strikes inside of Ukraine. ATACMS restrictions subject of intense consultations between Ukraine and its allies, according to Jake Sullivan. So National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan doesn't want to do this. There's pressure coming from Congress, there's pressure coming from American voters, pressure from our allies for Joe Biden to overrule Jake Sullivan and allow for ATACMS strikes as well as Storm Shadow, Scalp, and whatever deeper into Russia. And Putin finally responded. As of my last video, he hadn't responded yet, but he put out a video. It would mean that NATO is at war with Russia. So this clip is from RT News, but I am going to play it. I do think it's important for people to hear what Putin or Putin's body double had to say specifically on this topic. Let's go through it together.
There is an attempt to substitute concepts, because we are not talking about allowing or forbidding the Kiev regime to strike our territory. It already does that with the help of drones and other means. But
so he just said we're not forbidding Ukraine from attacking our territory. They're already doing that with their own domestically produced drones.
when we are talking about the use of precision weapons, long-range Western-made weapons, it is a completely different story. The fact is that I have already mentioned this, and any experts will confirm it, both in our country and in the West. The Ukrainian army is incapable of striking with modern Western-made long-range precision systems. It can only do that by using intelligence from satellites, which Ukraine does not have. They get the data only from EU satellites or from the United States. In general,
so he's saying it's impossible for Ukraine to use long-range precision weapons because they don't have the satellite network. This isn't true. There are private companies with satellite networks, and you can pay them a couple $100s for up to the date satellite images. So yes, I do think the United States and NATO countries are providing satellite intelligence to Ukraine for targeting information, but if Ukraine wanted to go to a private company, they can afford it and they can get these satellite images themselves.
From NATO satellites. That's the first thing. The second and very important thing, maybe the key one, is that the flight missions in these missile systems can, in fact, be inputted only by NATO military personnel. Ukrainian servicemen cannot do this.
So Putin just lied, saying that ATACMS and Storm Shadows and Scalps can only be programmed, the targeting information, can only be inputted by NATO personnel. This is nonsense because Ukraine has been using HIMARS to launch ATACMS and MiG jets to launch Storm Shadows into the occupied territories for almost a year now. So no, there aren't NATO personnel in the HIMARS trucks or in the Soviet jets. It's the Ukrainians inputting the targeting data themselves. Of course they can do this on their own. Putin's lying.
So it's not a question of allowing the Ukrainian regime to strike Russia with these weapons or not. It is a question of deciding whether or not a NATO country could be directly involved in a military conflict. If this decision is made, it will mean nothing else but the direct participation of NATO countries, the United States, European countries in the war in Ukraine. This is their direct participation. And this already, of course, significantly changes the very essence, the very nature of the conflict.
So Ukraine has been using ATACMS and Storm Shadows to strike Crimea and to strike Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. Putin is clowning himself by saying, by doing that, Ukraine isn't actually attacking Russia. Despite annexing this territory and adding these 5 provinces to his constitution, he's saying for some reason ATACMS or Storm Shadows launched on Russia's 1991 borders is different. Why is it different, Putin?
It will mean that NATO countries, the United States, European countries, are at war with Russia. And if that is the case, then having in mind the change in the very essence of this conflict, we will take appropriate decisions based on the threats that will be presented to us.
So what's Putin going to do? We will take appropriate decisions based on the threats that will be presented to us. That doesn't sound like nuclear war to me. Starmer responds to Putin's threats. Russia started the war and can end it at any time. All Russia has to do is go back to their own country and stay there. Stop trying to steal your neighbor's territory, and there's no more war. This is a good response from the UK Prime Minister. President Zelensky was also asked about this topic of lifting restrictions on long-range weapons, and I do want to share what President Zelensky had to say to this UK reporter.
President Zelensky, for British TV, what's your message to...
What's United Kingdom for your support, but we are still waiting for your permission. You know about it, I think, something.
Why do you need it so badly?
We need to survive.
Why does Ukraine need this permission? Zelensky just says it's a matter of survival. We need to survive. So the White House, as of yesterday, maintains that their stance on long-range missile restrictions for Ukraine is going to stay in place. So the theories now branch out, and let's go through a couple of these. The first one, this is floated by Alex Rafaglu. He's a DC correspondent, and he said a senior Western official told him that the first announcement on lifting Ukraine missile restrictions can only be expected when the first missile lands inside of Russia. This is possible, it makes sense. Why would you announce it formally until it happens? Just wait for it to happen and then the whole world knows the policy changed. So that's one theory. The other one is floated by The Telegraph, saying that President Biden may give the green light for Ukraine to use British Storm Shadow cruise missiles and French Scalp missiles, but not ATACMS. And for my European audience, this is going to drive you nuts. I keep getting this question, and I've answered it a couple times, but let me re-explain again. Why does the United States have veto power over other NATO partners? And it's the way that NATO is structured. The Secretary General of NATO, a civilian, is always a European, but the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, of NATO, is always American. It's currently this guy, General Christopher Cavali, and he answers to President Biden, to National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. And in a time of war, the militaries of other countries become subordinate to the Supreme Allied Commander, who's always American. So if the UK wants to get into a war with Argentina, probably won't involve the United States, they can do that. But if the UK wants to authorize the use of Storm Shadow missiles on Russian territory, that might trigger a war with NATO. That's going to draw the attention of the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, and he gets to have a say. This is why the United States has this veto power over Storm Shadow or Scalp cruise missiles. So here's the real reason why President Biden doesn't want to authorize ATACMS at this time. This is according to Bloomberg. The Kremlin may step up sabotage and cyber attacks against NATO if Ukraine is allowed to strike Russia with Western weapons. First thing we should say is that Putin will not use a nuke in the next 50 days because he's planning on Donald Trump returning to the White House. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance have already publicly said, if they're elected, Russia gets everything they want. All the territory that Russia has taken, they can keep forever. Sanctions will be lifted, and Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO, meaning there's no security guarantees. If Putin wants to start this war again in 4 or 5 years, he can do so. So Putin's not going to risk affecting the US election by using a nuclear weapon, but he can do a smaller provocation that could hurt Kamala Harris's chances of winning the White House. Russia could respond with direct or indirect attacks on US forces in other regions, such as the Middle East. I think this is the threat that the Russians have told the White House. If you lift these restrictions, if you allow Ukrainians to use specifically ATACMS, then we're going to bomb a military base in Iraq and kill like 20 or 30 of your soldiers. We're going to do this 2 or 3 weeks before your election so that Donald Trump can blame you and Kamala Harris for the deaths of your soldiers. I can honestly already see it. This is 100% something Donald Trump would say and do. If the Russians bombed a military base in Iraq, killed a bunch of US soldiers, Donald Trump would start screaming. Their deaths are the fault of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris for lifting these restrictions, for getting America directly involved in a war against Russia. And this isn't a conspiracy by me. This is what the Republicans, what Donald Trump is currently doing with the service members who died in the Kabul airport attack in 2021. So in August 26, 2021, 182 people were killed, 169 Afghan civilians, as well as 13 members of the US military. Now, nobody from the Trump campaign, Donald Trump, Speaker Johnson, anyone part of MAGA, gave a shit about these service members who died on the 1-year anniversary, August of 2022. Nobody mentioned it the 2-year anniversary, August of 2023. But now that we're in an election year, August of 2024, MAGA and people who support Trump won't stop trying to politicize the death of these service members. And they do it every day. Here is Speaker Mike Johnson tweeting about it this morning, September 15th. The 3-year anniversary was last month, and he's still tweeting about it every single day. Talking with the families, inviting them to Capitol Hill. I agree, these servicemen are heroes. I agree they should be given any recognition for their ultimate sacrifice to our country. But that's not why Speaker Johnson is using them. That's not why Donald Trump is using them. They're using the deaths of these servicemen to try to politically harm Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And to make my point, more U.S. servicemen died under the 4 years that Donald Trump was president than in the previous 3.5 years that Joe Biden was president. If your vote is determined by which president allowed for fewer service members to die, then you shouldn't be voting for Donald Trump. But Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, and the Democrats aren't going to exploit the fallen heroes to try to win an election. But Donald Trump would. This incident occurred last month, and Donald Trump tried to go to Arlington Cemetery for a publicity stunt. But Donald Trump is such an idiot. He got in front of the grave of one of these fallen heroes and gave the thumbs up to the photographer. Is this an appropriate human response when appearing before the grave of a fallen U.S. soldier? He also got into a physical altercation with the staff of Arlington Cemetery because it violates federal law to campaign in a military cemetery. So we had a presidential debate 4 days ago, 5 days ago, and it didn't shift anything. We got new polls out of the swing states. Kamala Harris is leading in national polls, but the national polls don't matter. It doesn't matter how many people in California, Oregon, or Washington vote for Kamala Harris, because there's only 7 states that matter. And as of today, Donald Trump is leading in Arizona, Georgia, and Michigan. So yeah, I think the Kremlin is feeling pretty confident, and even if Biden doesn't lift these restrictions on ATACMS, Kim Jong-un or Putin or Iran could do this anyways. Kill a bunch of US soldiers 3 weeks before the election, and then signal for Trump, that's your opportunity to politicize this, to make this a national story, and try to stop Kamala Harris from being elected president. I'm riled up, guys. So let's go to Kremlin State TV and get their reaction to the lifting of restrictions of the use of ATACMS. This is from Russian Media Monitor. Soloveyov argues with Tigran about long-range missiles. So what are they saying on Kremlin State TV? This war, or a special military operation, is going according to plan. Military actions always follow a plan. Someone might disagree, but the way I see it, this is a good plan. 2.5 years into Putin's special military operation, Russia has been invaded, and this guy is on Kremlin State TV saying this is a good plan. If you look at what's happening on the front lines, what proves that it's a good plan is that in Ukraine, they understand that dragging NATO into the war is the only chance they have. This means that our plan is good. We are fighting correctly. We have learned. There are probably mistakes, but who am I to judge? I'm not a military expert. I'm just looking at the map. About these strikes against our territory, it seems to me that what the West is doing is sending us a note. Slow down your advancement because we have to make Kamala Harris president. Slow down. I don't think it'll work, but it doesn't matter. Soloveyov then has to jump in. You say that everything is going according to plan. Pardon me, but the Nazi troops have invaded the territory of the Kursk region. Wow, not even Soloveyov is willing to say this is a good plan. This wasn't part of our plan. We have a clear and concise doctrine, and we act according to it, including the use of nuclear weapons. Per our doctrine, we should have struck long ago. So what are you proposing? I'm proposing for us to trust our Supreme. That's obvious. But our Supreme just said, if you do it, this is war. What kind of measures we will take is another question. This is being decided by the Supreme. He is being advised by the military. The General Staff puts it together and they decide. They won't ask us. But we should understand that if the Supreme said so, he said it back on February 24th. All commands have been given. All the plans do exist. Let me remind you that we conducted exercises with tactical nuclear weapons. So this is Solovyov's security blanket to talk about nuclear weapons. Because he's not officially a member of the government, he can say whatever he wants. He only says stuff that the Kremlin approves, by the way. But it's not Putin, it's not the Kremlin threatening nuclear war at this time. They're just saying it on Russian state TV. So my thoughts officially is that I think Biden is going to approve British Storm Shadow cruise missiles and French Scalp missiles, but he's going to restrict ATACMS for the next 50 days. The election's on November 5th. On November 6th, we'll know a lot more, and we can start planning this war for the next couple years. In the meantime, I know people in Ukraine are suffering. Russian guided aerial bombs strike a Kharkiv residential building, leaving dozens injured. A rescue operation is underway at the site, where fire and debris are reported between the 9th and 12th floors. Children are among the injured. Ukraine just has to hold on. Here's an interesting headline. Russia releases 45 Indians who were tricked into fighting in Ukraine. Modi went to Russia to speak with Putin, and one of the things he asked for was the release of his own citizens. In the spring of 2024, Indian authorities said that they had uncovered a network of Russian recruiters luring Indians to Russia with the promise of jobs and enrollment in universities, and then they were gang-pressed into the Russian military. They filmed videos asking their prime minister for help, and kudos to Modi, he got these people released, so thank you to President Modi. Russia just lost 45 soldiers. Ukraine says Russia used strategic bombers to hit a grain vessel near Romania. Ukrainian's foreign minister called the strike a brazen attack on freedom of navigation and global food security. So the ship was transiting grain from Ukraine through the territorial waters of, I think, Romania, and Russia hit it with a missile. This is something Russia's been capable of doing for the last year, but there's been this truce between Ukraine and Russia. I remember there was this empty tanker that Ukraine destroyed over a year ago, and then Ukraine never did it again. Ukraine has these kamikaze drone boats, and Russia is still allowed to ship grain in and out through the Black Sea. They're still allowed to ship oil and gas through the Black Sea. So this truce has been holding for a year. If Ukraine can get their exports in and out, then the Russians have been allowed to as well. But if Russia wants to go scorched earth on shipping in the Black Sea and they start attacking these grain ships, then Ukraine has to respond. They have to start using their drone boats to attack Russian civilian ships, so Russia can't get their exports out either. This is bad for both sides, for the world, for food security. Mostly bad for people living in Africa and the Middle East who rely on these grain exports. Russian central bank raises the key interest rate to 19% as inflation surges. The Central Bank of Russia raised its key interest rate for the 7th time in the last 14 months, when last summer it was at 7.5%. So now, economically, everything in Russia is a disaster. True inflation, people are estimating, is around 20 or 30% right now. It's so bad, the screenshot went viral. This is from a cafe in Russia called Excellence, and they're now including a 10% surcharge on checks for the devaluation of the ruble. Because the currency is collapsing so fast, prices are going up so fast, this restaurant is just saying, we're adding 10% to your bill because our currency is becoming worthless. Let's get to the good news for Ukraine. Ukraine launched the production of their own 155mm artillery shells. Previously, they had already started the production of old Soviet artillery system shells. It's a different size, but they're now producing their own NATO standard 155mm artillery shells. This is good news. IMF approves a 1.1 billion tranche for Ukraine, setting conditions for reforms. It's good news. This is hilarious. Spain vetoed a Hungarian bid for a train group over Ukraine concerns. So a Hungarian company tried to buy this train company in Spain, and the Spanish government blocked it because of Hungary's support for Russia. Good job, Spain. Finland announces a $130 million aid package for Ukraine. Thank you so much to the people of Finland. Latvia to provide Patria AMVs and drones to Ukraine in 2025, worth 40 million euros. Thank you so much to the people of Latvia. Let's now get to the POW swaps. Ukraine-Russia prisoner swap, Azov fighters among those freed. Ukraine has carried out a prisoner swap with Russia for the second time in 2 days. So there were 2 prisoner swaps in 2 days. The first one was 103, including 23 Azovstal defenders. People have been trying to get these people released for over 2 years. And then the other one was 206 POWs brokered by the UAE. I do want to thank the Emiratis. They don't have to be doing this, but they're choosing to facilitate the negotiations between these POW swaps. So thank you so much to the people of the UAE. 2 videos I want to share. These are Russian conscripts who were captured in Kursk 4 or 5 weeks ago. Part of these prisoner exchanges, they're being returned home. And these Russian conscripts don't look very excited to be going back to Russia.
Всем ли оказана медицинская помощь? Да. Какие-то замечания по содержанию в плену есть? Нету. Что вас ждет, знаете? Нет. Вообще нет? Нам не говорили. Вас ждет ФСБ и статья из Уголовного кодекса за сдачу в плен. Что-то вы приуныли. Как-то.
You can just see how young they are. They're all 18, 19, 20. So let's now contrast it. These are Ukrainian defenders, some of whom have been in captivity for over 2 years, finally being returned home.
Хлопці, вітаємо вас вдома!
Дякуємо, дякуємо.
Зараз у кожного буде такий звіт.
Эльдар, это 2 полицейских чуть, Лошадя 4. Едь полицейский сюда, все остальные туда дали.
Зараз кожному роздамо. Проходьте далі, проходьте туди, будь ласка. Вітаємо вас вдома. Зараз вам кожному роздадуть, кожному. Доброго. Боже, наші хороші, дякуємо, що витримали, дякуємо, рідненькі. Вам допомога потрібна? Ні, що? Куди ми самі йдемо? Вітаємо вас вдома, хлопці. Проходьте, рідненькі, проходьте. Зараз видадуть кожному прапор, кожному. Добрий день. Проходьте.
That's all for this update video. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. If you found this video informative, give me a thumbs up. Best way to support the channel. Comments and questions, let me know down below. I love hearing from you guys. Till the next video, keep defending the truth, keep defending democracy.